Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. On behalf of Sangeeta Gopal, who's an associate professor in cinema studies, and Bish Sen, who is an associate professor in media studies. He's also one of our speakers today. Welcome. Um, this is the second talk in the Conversations About Our World series. The title is Changing Geopolitics of Global Communication in a Post-COVID World. And our speaker who's visiting is Daya Thussu, Professor of International Communication at Hong Kong Baptist University. I'll introduce him and Bish in just a moment, but there's a few more elements to our introduction. So I'd like to read a territorial statement first. The University of Oregon is located on the Kalapuya Ilihi, the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya people. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. Today, descendants are citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians of Oregon. And they continue to make important contributions in their communities at the University of Oregon and across the land we now refer to as Oregon. The University of Oregon has operated in various locations in the state, and we'd like to acknowledge, as part of this event, the traditional homelands of the Kalapuya people in the Eugene area, the Chinook, Clackamas, Kalapuya, Cathlamet, Molalla, Multnomah, Tualatin, and other tribes and bands. Some of them are in the Portland area. And the Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Susla, who are in the Charleston area. Okay. Can everyone see my video again?
I can, yes.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so I'd like to thank our sponsors next. So various units at the University of Oregon have sponsored this event. We wanted to thank and acknowledge the support from the Asian Studies Program, the Center for Asian and Pacific Studies, the Center for the Study of Women in Society, the College of Arts and Sciences, the Departments of Anthropology, History, Indigenous Race and Ethnic Studies, the Department of Sociology, the Global Health Program, Global Studies Institute, the Division of Global Engagement, and Oregon Humanities Center's Endowment for the Science and Humanities. Before I introduce our speakers, I just wanted to thank our team, which includes Kylie Post, Melody Moore, Jacob Box, Morgan Hayward, Ward Biagne, Laurie O'Halloran, Dennis Galvan, who heads Global Engagement. I'm sure I've forgotten someone. I apologize. But thank you to all of you who have made this and other events possible. I also just want to remind you that there are 4 talks in this series. Today's is the second one. We have another one, which will be on May 13th at 5 p.m. Pacific. The title is Identity, Ambivalence, Homecoming, Travels Between Asian and Asian American Studies. And that will feature Roy Chan, who's an associate professor in Chinese in the Department of East Asian Languages and Literatures at the University of Oregon, and Andrew Lung, assistant professor, Department of English at UC Berkeley. Okay. The format will be the following. Bish and Daya will have a conversation, which we will watch. And then we'll have at the end about 5 to 10 minutes for questions, which can be posted in the chat window of your interface. Now I can finally introduce our speakers. So Daya Thussu is a professor of international communication at the Hong Kong Baptist University. He was distinguished visiting professor and inaugural Disney chair in global media between 2018 and 2019 at Schwarzman College in Tsinghua University in Beijing. For many years, Professor Thussu was professor of international communication and co-director of India Media Center as a research advisor to the China Media Center at the University of Westminster in London. Professor Thussu is the founder and managing editor of the Sage Journal, Global Media and Communication. He's author or editor of 20 books. His latest co-edited book is BRICs Media, Reshaping the Global Communication Order, ? Among his other main publications are Electronic Empires, International Communication, Continuity and Change, Media on the Move, Global Flow and Contraflow, News as Entertainment, The Rise of Global Infotainment, Internationalizing Media Studies, Media and Terrorism, Global Perspectives, which was co-edited, Communicating India's Soft Power, Buddha to Bollywood, Mapping BRICs Media, which was co-edited, and China's Media Go Global, which is also co-edited. He's currently writing a book to be entitled Changing Geopolitics of Global Communication. Thank you for joining us, Daya. Bish Sen is Associate Professor, Media Studies at the University of Oregon. Bish's research interests include global media studies, Indian popular culture, and new media history and theory. His publications include Digital Culture and Politics in Contemporary India, The Making of an Info Nation, which was published by Routledge in 2016. He's also author of Channeling Cultures, Television Studies from India, which was published in 2014 by Oxford University Press. His current project is a study of global reality television. Thank you for joining us and for running this conversation, Bish. I will stop my introduction there and hand it over to Daya and Bish. Thank you.
Thank you, Arafat, for those great introductions. And thanks to you and to Kylie and the rest of the EO staff for organizing this stimulating and much needed series on conversations about our world. If these troubled times have made one thing abundantly clear, it's we, as Daya was mentioning in a conversation just a little while ago, we all belong to the same world. And for survival, to understand it better. And for me, it's a real pleasure to welcome Daya Thussu, who's I would describe as a towering figure in the field of global media studies, to this conversation series. As the titles that Arafat read out, and I'm just picking out a couple that perhaps got lost. News as entertainment, the rise of global infotainment, or media and terrorism, global perspectives. Daya Thussu is one of those rare media scholars who has consistently urged us to go beyond the framework of the nation state and instead conceptualize communication and media as being fundamentally global in their nature. And I think what Daya's work has brilliantly demonstrated is the interconnectedness of national media systems, the incessant flow of media content across cultures and borders, and the immense varieties of reception and meaning generated by different segments of the global audience. So my conversation with Daya this evening both looks back at some of his crucial early work in the field of global media studies, and then I wanted to move on to discuss his current work on the changing geopolitics of global communication. Welcome, Daya, to the conversations about our work.
Thank you so much. It's a privilege and honor to be talking to you. Thank you for inviting me.
It's our pleasure. Yeah.
All organizers to organize it. Thank you.
So Daya, I wanted to start with something you wrote a while back. It was a very important essay titled Mapping Global Media Flow and Contraflow. I think it came out in 2007, where you described the global flow of media as consisting of three parts. First part is dominant flows of Americana. I recall the title of one of the books we all read as students, The Media Are American, was a Tunstall, I think.
Yeah.
The second is localization of Americana. And finally, the third sort of category you proposed was subaltern contraflows. I'm just wondering if today in 2021, you think this threefold categorization still holds true, or whether we need to modify it to account for newer developments.
Thank you. And thank you for your kind words about my work. That book was actually written, organized around 2005 and 6. It was published in 2007. Mm-hmm. And it was one of the first dedicated volumes which looked at the rise of the media outside the dominant Western world. But the focus of that whole project was really on television media, audiovisual media. There was very little on the internet, on social media, because at that time, these were not that huge, especially in, Asia or developing world. It was very, very small access to internet and the way that transformed communication. So that would be the first thing to say, that if I was to do a similar project today, the focus would be on digital media rather than the legacy media, if you like. But the essential categorization, which was about, this dominant, then kind of localization, hybridization of this Americana, and the subaltern one. In those 15 years, the subaltern has become much more important. Notably, if you look at what's happening in this part of the world, in the sinosphere, as it were, massive expansion of media and communication. And also, when I was doing that book, there was hardly anything on Turkey, for instance. Today, Turkey is probably the third largest exporter of television dramas to the world. It's a huge industry, and it's got very wide acceptance across many, many countries, Central Asia, all the way down to Pakistan, and then also in parts of Latin America. So there's that. But the dominant flows are, so if you look at what my list was in that book, if I was to make a similar list today, it would be very, not entirely different, but it would be a different list, because today the most powerful media company would be Alphabet. It'd be Google. It won't be one of those traditional media companies. Apple will appear there in the top 3, 4. So that's the other factor what one would take into account, that the extraordinary growth of these digital corporations, and how the communication media world has converged into this digital space. So this idea of GAFAM, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft, that combination, which is without exception all major American companies. So the dominant flow hasn't really changed in that sense. But you also have BAT, you have Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, which are essentially Chinese companies, but increasingly operating in a global space. So it would be a more, some aspects of that basic categorization would still be valid, but it would need a lot of, amendments and additions and editing, because obviously so much has changed, especially in the digital context.
And that's wonderful. Just a quick follow-up question. So, you put a lot of emphasis on this term Americana, and, I'm thinking obviously Disney and Hollywood and McDonald's and Coca-Cola, etc., all the signifiers of American dominance. And so in this new edition that we're imagining, in a sense, the power of Americana has diminished, right? If the subaltern is speaking, as it were, the Americana is now has less salience and less import.
Yes, and that's an arguable point. Because in US especially, there is this whole debate about this kind of declinist discourse, right? That America is declining. But in fact, yesterday there's a fantastic piece in the Financial Times by Martin Wolf. It's worth looking at, and he sort of basically says actually that's not the case, because if you look at various aspects, not just the like media communication world, but hard power, intellectual power, etc., the US is still very, very important and far ahead of everyone else, including the nearest competitor, which is China. But I just want to add one little thing. You mentioned earlier about Jeremy Tunstall's idea of this media are American, which was a 1977 book. He actually wrote another book in 2007. In fact, the same year my book was published. And that book was called Media Were American. And the subtitle was The Decline of Anglo-American Media. So it's 2007. Right. 14 years later, obviously, if you look at major markets, if you look at, for instance, a lot of my work has been about news media rather than, entertainment media. If you think of the BBC, for instance, which is supposed to be the most credible, most global international broadcaster, it's not available in China. In fact, it is only available in some five-star hotels. The presence of BBC in India is so tiny that it doesn't actually measure on any measuring systems of how many people are watching it. That's 40% of the world's population. In Europe, they have their own. In America, it's a marginal player. In Latin America, it doesn't exist. In Middle East, they have dozens of channels now, Al Jazeera's of the world. In Africa, the Chinese are getting in a big way. So, that's an interesting case in point that actually, and I'm talking about obviously not American media, but British media, but it is an interesting shift because, there is obvious decline in terms of its reach. I'm less sure about its influence has declined as much, because it's still, if you think of how the narratives are created, what gets published on the editorial page of the New York Times still has a lot more influence than what gets published in a newspaper in China or elsewhere, for various reasons. So I think there is an interesting, and when that book was published, Tunstall's second version of that book, there was a lot of criticism that he was just celebrating this decline, but actually in reality, if you look closely and carefully, the fundamentals of that dominant structure haven't changed. Some have argued, in fact, they have become more important because they are not directly, think of, for example, a phenomenon like Netflix, and see how local their content is in major markets. So if you did not know this is an American streaming service, you would think, oh, it's Korean or Indian or Turkish or whatever. So it's more complicated than what Tunstall was suggesting.
Right. And sort of still staying with some of the earlier work. I mean, so you were trying to map out, do new cartography of global media, and simultaneously with it, I think you were asking that us media scholars, we had this obligation to internationalize media studies, by which what I understand by what I almost think of as a clarion call that you issued is that to date, at that point, and perhaps even today, so often media studies consisted of not only putting a huge emphasis on sort of media of the global north, but also when it studied media in the global south, it was just sort of utilizing concepts, categories, theories developed in the north and just applying them, right? That application model. And I was wondering if you could just go back to your mindset then. What made you ask for internationalization of media studies, and then follow up by saying, well, do you think the field has responded, and are we in a better off place today in the field that we are getting more perspectives and theoretical insights?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. Actually, my academic background is not in media and communication. I have a master's in history, I have a master's in politics, I have a PhD in international relations. So I was an outsider to the field when I started teaching it. And as luck would have it, it was the era of globalization, things were opening up. So scholars, policy people, journalists had to think of these odd places which were normally just a kind of, the phrase was coups and earthquake syndrome. That is, there's a coup and there's a story about a particular part of the world. And then whole, the deregulation, privatization, opening up of markets. I mean, you've written about that in the context of India, this whole idea of a digital nation, right? So there was a lot more material available, which almost then forced people to think beyond the very narrow national boundaries within which we taught media studies. And because I was teaching mostly, almost exclusively, courses about globalization, and I was feeling deeply dissatisfied that what we are teaching is still very Eurocentric, right? And what wasn't there was almost not even a perfunctory engagement with history, with tradition, with culture. There was one major area which I thought was missing. If you look at media communication studies, it sort of starts in a very technical sense, telegraph and cables and radio and television and etc. So I was thinking, well, actually, the communication is so much more complicated. How did ideas travel before cables were set up? Think of religious ideas. The largest Muslim country in the world is Indonesia, which is thousands of miles away from Saudi Arabia, where Islam was born. Think of Buddhism. The largest Buddhist country today is China. Buddhism started in India and spread across Asia and elsewhere. So that was one kind of concern I had, that there's a lot missing. Fundamental things are missing in terms of history. The other was about religion itself, because with a few exceptions, most of media communication scholars worked within a kind of critical, if you like, liberal Marxist orientation, whereas religion was not really a major focus of study. And then you have a revolution in Iran, which changes the whole geopolitics of the region and politicization of religion. And we cannot make sense of what is happening, or what's now happening in Turkey or in India. So I think there was this kind of concern that, and because of, as I said, my background in these subjects, so this needs a bit more attention. So I as you know, I run a book series, actually 2 book series for Routledge. And they're called, one is called Internationalizing Media Studies, and the other is called Advances in Internationalizing Media Studies. So I thought I need to have some kind of infrastructure within which one could contribute in a modest way to this discourse. And I have to say, in those, so the book that you referred to was published in 2009. That was the first book in the series. We've now published 24 books, different parts, covering different aspects of global media and communication. And I would say that there is actually a lot more engagement with this subject across the world, partly also because in the Western academia, which is a vague term, but you know what I mean, in the dominant places where discourses are constructed, there's also awareness that we need to find out. For example, look, China is a fantastic case in point. There was very little knowledge of China or its media. It was just like, this authoritarian system, period, nothing else. Now there are, if not dozens, hundreds of publications coming out every year in respectable journals about the Sinosphere. Just a colleague, former colleague in London has published 2 volumes. One is already out, that is in the process, on Africology, which is all about not just media, but how we think about Africa, published by Routledge. In the area where I'm now, in East Asia, there is at least 3 or 4 very good books published in recent years, which are focusing on this comparative media research and internationalization. The final point I'll make in that context is that, there was a controversial kind of intervention around beginning of this century that, we should de-Westernize the media studies, the communication studies. And my argument for this internationalizing was that, there's a lot of very valuable work done in the Western academia in media and communication field. We cannot just say, okay, this is all, of no value. It's fundamentally important. What we need to do is widen it, the remit of discipline, adding new ideas. And so we don't just, the rest of the world doesn't just become case studies, they actually contribute to theory building.
Great, that's great. I want to turn now to some of your more recent work. And you've been arguing recently that the BRICs nation, and I'll come back to your use of that term or category a little bit later, perhaps, have been contributing to the de-Americanization of the internet. So now we're not talking about legacy media, but as you mentioned, today's media or new media companies, the biggest ones, are all dealing somehow with, through, by the internet, right? And so you're contending that in whatever fashion these nations are contributing to repeat myself, to the de-Americanization. Can you spell out what you mean by de-Americanization of the internet, and what the consequences of such a thing will be? And that was.
Thank you. This is a thing I wrote for a book just been published, actually. I called it BRICs, De-Americanizing the Internet, but I had a question mark at the end. And I'm hoping to develop that chapter into a monograph at some point. I've been in touch with some people, publishers, but I need a little more time to think through it. So BRICS, as you know, is a grouping of 5 major countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Its origins are interesting. It was established as a grouping in 2007-8, around the time of financial crisis. The argument was that we cannot depend on the vagaries of American financial system. We need to have an alternative arrangement. It was actually a Russian idea, which was then appropriated by the Chinese, and they said we got to have, so it was only BRIC initially: Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And if you remember, at that time, Brazil also had a very sort of pinko kind of, it's a very progressive government at that time. So there was a kind of coalition of major economies trying to find an alternative. And China really appropriated it because it wanted to tell the world, look, we are not the only rising power. Look at these other countries. They are also rising, so don't feel threatened. And over this period, increasingly, Chinese priorities have changed. So BRICS is not what it used to be, and China is now talking about BRICS Plus, etc. So that's the kind of background to it. And in terms of specifically on internet, if you think of which is the largest internet in the world, it's the Mandarin internet. Nearly 1 billion people now in China have access to the internet, which is the second largest internet in the world. That's in India. I called it the world's largest open internet because the Chinese one is not open. So and then Russia also has a very interesting kind of internet. It's not as controlled as the Chinese one, but it also has some of the platforms which are actually Russian. Chinese is entirely Chinese. So that then raises interesting questions about issues of, if you like, cyber sovereignty, issues of internet control. So I'll speak to that in a minute more, but I thought of this basic point, which is how internet itself has changed. When it became a kind of global phenomena, it was privatized, it was beginning to globalize in the mid-1990s. 60% of people who used the internet were Americans. Today, that figure has shrunk to a single digit. And the largest growth is in Asia. I already mentioned China and India, but also in other major countries, big population countries, Indonesia, Turkey, Japan, Nigeria, etc. So although it's infrastructure, it's commerce, it's regulation, it's technology is still very much dominated by a very few hugely powerful, exclusively American companies. But its usage has changed. People who are actually on the internet are not, it's not a Western phenomena, it's actually increasingly a de-Western phenomena. So that was one kind of argument for thinking about beyond the American internet. Secondly, in case of China specifically, the debate about Chinese internet has been largely about censorship and control. Understandably, because you and I study and grew up and in free societies where you argue and discuss and disagree, and you don't get imprisoned for being, disloyal, at least intellectually. In the Chinese case, what they did, and I wrote something about that some years ago, 3 years ago. I called it cyber capitalism with Chinese characteristics, in the sense that they were able to take care of competition. They didn't allow the Googles and the Facebooks of the world to operate in their market. And in the process, they were able to develop their own. And today, some of these companies, Alibaba would be a notable case, are not just confined to the territorial space of China, they're actually operating globally. In cloud computing, for instance, after Amazon and Microsoft, they are like third or fourth in the global pecking order. So what that did was countries are then looking at it and say, well, actually, Chinese have done it. And we've been obsessed with the censorship discourse, and we've forgotten in the process there's a commercial discourse. You have, so even in countries like India, which follows this kind of multi-stakeholder model, essentially all the platforms in India are American. The largest population of Facebook is in India. WhatsApp, again, largest population is in India. But they don't have Indian platforms, unlike China, where every major digital platform that you and I use has a Chinese equivalent. So that's, I think, in terms of de-Americanization, that was one of my arguments, that there's actually some fundamental change happening in the infrastructure of the internet. And there are countries which are now looking at this other model, because it's happening in parallel with this, if you like, authoritarian turn in many parts of the world, and governments are finding it much more, acceptable to control information. And they say, look at Chinese, what they did, and we should follow that. So then there's also another thing which I have written extensively about also in that chapter that you mentioned, was the connection between digitization and development, which often gets ignored in many of discourses in the kind of mainstream. Now, the Chinese have done phenomenally well in terms of dealing with extreme poverty. They announced last year that they have nobody living in extreme poverty. In early 90s, 700 plus million people lived in extreme poverty in China, which was the largest chunk of people living in extreme poverty on the planet. That's like $2 a day, World Bank estimation. So that's something which they have done very, very successfully. And that also raises some interesting questions about how do you conceptualize the internet? How do you think beyond an American version of what internet is? So there's this development aspect, there's this whole infrastructure issue, but there's also, you know, cyber commerce. The Chinese have again shown a very successful model. Think of 5G, for instance, it is very advanced. Think of mobile payment systems, extremely efficient. You know, this is creating, again, a new kind of alternative internet. And I think that some of it all is that there is an argument to be made, which I have sketched out in that chapter, about thinking of de-Americanization. Right. Although, I also say in that chapter, it's not going to be a G2, China versus the US, because if you think of the European Union and what they have done in terms of media, internet regulation, really interesting, and that has been adopted by many countries as a model in terms of privacy issues, for instance. So what I've argued in that is going to be a multilingual and quite decentered internet. You know, some people call it balkanization of internet, right. But that's already beginning to happen. So there's a Turkish internet and there's a Russian internet, and there's, but unlike the Chinese one, everybody else is using, well, mostly using American platforms. I think that is the interesting point, that the Chinese are creating an alternative system of infrastructure, not just in terms of platform, but also if you think of their investment in undersea cables and providing, you know, that kind of infrastructure to allow these ideas to transfer across the globe. Yeah.
Wonderful. So I had one last question there, but since we are running out of time, I'm going to save that and maybe turn to Arafat to open it to any audience questions. And if I can sneak it in later, I'll do that.
Fine.
I don't see any questions coming up right now. Let me just check the chat. Okay, well, it seems I can sneak in my last question, which really is a combination of two, because you wonderfully sketched out these many internets or the balkanization, and I'm thinking, does the creation of this universe full of many competing internets, does it also link up with another concept you've used quite richly, that of soft power? So when we talk about de-Americanization, does that entail there are zones of soft power emerging along with different internets, sort of, different internets being carriers of different zones of soft power?
Thank you. As you know, the concept of soft power is very American in its origin.
Of course.
And its timing when it was coined is interesting. It was, I think, an article that Professor Joseph Nye wrote in 1991. I think it was in Foreign Policy Journal, and then he developed it to a full-length book. So it's end of Cold War. It's the world is changing, and this idea comes up. And given that there's so much power of American elite media, American intellectual discourse, that this becomes a kind of phrase that every foreign ministry in the world is adopting. We've got to think of soft power. As you know, I wrote a book about soft power of India. That's the only book I've written about India so far. And I was fundamentally arguing that, one has to kind of go back a little bit in history. It cannot just be about, Hollywood or about news media or internet, if you like. So I was thinking, how do you explain the influence, maybe not power, because power is a complicated concept, influence of, say, India on the ancient world, for example. I mentioned earlier about Buddhism. How did these ideas travel? Why is it the largest religious structure on the planet, the temple of Angkor Wat in Cambodia, is a temple dedicated to Vishnu, who is a foundational figure in Hindu religion? Um, why is it that a university that existed in what is eastern India, Bihar today, called Nalanda, from 6th century to 11th, 12th century, was the most important seat of learning in the world? And you people have global studies. I would be surprised if some of the faculty has not heard of it, because why would they know? It's not in textbooks. It's not in. So is that soft power or is it hard power? So that's why, as I mentioned earlier, I have history background. I was really looking at these arguments that actually, if you're looking at civilizational states, then you have to go back a little bit in history. And the American conceptualization of soft power doesn't do that. Then you have another kind of aspect to that, which is countries such as China, which are seen, understandably, outside China as hard powers. In fact, the phrase used now is sharp power. The powers which are, I'm quoting here, penetrating and perforating the international liberal order. And as you probably know, China has spent a lot of resources on its, for example, international broadcasting. The figures are difficult to ascertain, but the consensus is we're talking about billions of dollars every year on promoting the Chinese version of world events. And soft power is a big thing in China. So, some version of you see in every major power, and that's not surprising, because you want to combine the softer aspects of your foreign policy with the hard power. But essentially, in case of the United States, it is the most powerful country, not because of Harvard or Hollywood, but because it is the most powerful economy in the world, and militarily it's ahead of everybody else. So I think it's and with internet also, you could argue that power, in fact, has been strengthened, because if you have access to the global data, then remember what Snowden told us, what you can do with that data. So, that's also a kind of control, and it is indirect and it is soft. So you could argue, internet is providing new kind of soft power resources to largely the United States, because where it is still based, despite the changes that I indicated earlier.
Thanks, Daya. And in closing, we just have a couple of minutes left, I think, since we cannot escape talking about COVID, as we hopefully look forward to a post-COVID world. What do you see any significant changes, because of this experience in the sphere of media and communication at a global level?
Well, first thing is to say that if there wasn't this connectivity, just imagine how much more serious this pandemic would have been for the world at large, right? In terms of direct transfer of money to poor people around the world, basic information about what to do, etc. And what we're doing now, we are having this Zoom conversation. There would have been no higher education or schooling for a whole year or more. So, but it also is a kind of rupture, like 2008 was a rupture in this whole globalization discourse that, I mentioned BRICs in that context. I think COVID is another, there will be a pre and post-COVID world. And of course, it's very difficult to predict, because as we speak, things in my own country, in your country, are in pretty dire situation. So it's not over yet. So to talk about post-COVID would be, in my view, premature at this stage. But it is a kind of rupture. There's already some trends that we can identify. One is, of course, the return of the state. That, state doesn't matter. And if there's no states, you would have famine and you would have riots across the world. Second, it has also led to the notion of deglobalization. Nation comes first. We've seen that in all its glory in European Union at the beginning of the pandemic, where Brussels was not doing anything. Governments were left to fend for themselves. You remember, Italy had to say, okay, they got some aid from China, not from Brussels. They're part of the European Union. Of course, they've sorted themselves out since then. So trend towards deglobalization. And finally, a turn towards a kind of more authoritarian tendency in politics. We've seen that in many parts of the world, and I think that will perhaps become stronger in coming years.
Well, those are great closing thoughts, and thanks for a very stimulating conversation. Let me offer you a virtual cup of chai.
Thank you. Thank you. Next time we meet, I'll buy you a coffee. So you can have it.
And I'm going to hand it over to Arafat for some closing thoughts.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Bish, and especially thank you, Daya. This is a fascinating conversation. We want to wish everyone participating and everyone viewing safe and good health. And I also just wanted to plug our next talk once again. The next talk will be taking place on, just a moment here. Again, the title is Identity, Ambivalence, Homecoming, Travels Between Asian and Asian American Studies. It's Thursday, May 13th at 5 p.m. Pacific. I hope you can all join us, and thank you to everyone who joined us on this conversation. Take care, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thanks. Bye.